Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Well, first of all, what do you make of the, because it depends on whose side you're looking at it from. The governor has inaugurated, I believe, the winning team, but as they are saying that is, the law has not been taken into consideration, and it is APC's contention through its National Publicity Secretary that the governor didn't have any business conducting that election. In fact, if you had followed the news, he had said that it was a wanton waste of public funds. But what would be your view on this situation, Dr. Lateef?
Well, the situation in Osun State, quite unfortunately, I think it's something I've described elsewhere as a country legal controversies or conundrum, and unfortunately, mischievously pursued by our politicians. So we don't really need the controversies at all if all the parties, have simply complied with the requirements of law. And what is that requirement? I understand that an election held in Osun State over the weekend, or what was called an election, and which, with all sense of responsibility, I've also taken my time to assess, and I've classified it as a sham. But whatever it is a contention of the government of Osun State that they had an election, and then it is a contention on the other side of the APC and others that election ought not to have held. And I think this is the right position according to law, because prior to that election, we had, several court judgments, and the most significant one being the one delivered on the 10th of February 2025, and which was the judgment of the Court of Appeal, which clearly affirmed that there were no vacancies at the local government council in Osun State. The court came to that conclusion, one, by affirming the appeal of the APC and other parties arising from a Federal High Court judgment delivered in November 2022. And in doing so, the court actually literally struck out the Federal High Court judgment that had purportedly dismissed or sacked the APC elected chairman, and also purportedly invalidated the election that produced them. So when the Court of Appeal did that on the 10th of February, what they did implicitly was to restore those chairmen back to their seats. So if the seats were not vacant in the first place, then what was the need or rush, or desperation, if you like, by the Osun State government and the electoral body in Osun State, OSEC, to conduct a fresh election? And for me, I think, as I said earlier, all of these are contrary because parties, on different sides, have simply refused to comply with due process of law. So I think it is in that context that those who have advocated or who has urged the federal government to withhold the allocations, have made those call, because I think if the resources of the public were to properly apply, then they should be channeled to the appropriate, I would say, sources or hand, so that so the government has a duty to do that. So the point I'm trying to make in essence is basically that all of these so-called controversies are clearly avoidable. And I think politicians simply need to toe the path of honor, due process, and legality.
When the Court of Appeal overruled, I believe it was the State High Court, and as you said, everything has then gone back to the status quo of where it was. Now, at the Court of Appeal, I believe, they overturned that Federal High Court decision.
Exactly.
What was the reason for that?
Okay, the reason basically was that the Court of Appeal on the 10th of February decided that the Federal High Court in Osogbo that purportedly invalidated the local government election in Osun State that was held, I think, on the 5th of October 2022, and that also purportedly sacked the elected chairman. So the Court of Appeal decided that the Federal High Court had no jurisdiction to take that suit in the first place. And the Court of Appeal went ahead to actually strike out the suit. What that technically means in law is that these local government chairmen were never sacked.
Yeah.
The election that produced them was never invalidated. And this is why I said earlier that if this were a true situation of things according to law, and from the decision of the highest court in the land, in that circumstance, before the Supreme Court, then there was no basis for conducting any election into those offices.
Okay. Now, it was the INEC, the Electoral Commission, no less, that declared that in Osun State, all 30 seats had been won by the PDP. Now there has been a call, as you've mentioned, principally by Felix Morka, ABC National Publicity Secretary, towards the government to the federal authorities not to release their allocations. Now, can that be done? Because aren't these constitutional provisions? And I would have expected that the Governor Adeleke, would have been very keen on observing constitutional provisions. So can the federal government indeed accede to the request of Felix Morka or the advice of Felix Morka without going further into legal wranglings?
Okay, thank you for that question. First, allocation to local government or any arm of the government for that matter, and I don't want to go needlessly legalist here, is a constitutional matter. So, and quite correctly, the Supreme Court in the popular, what do we call it again now, in the popular local government autonomy decision made last year, made it quite clear that the local government were entitled to their own independent and separate allocation, from the federation account. So yes. The question then is, if the federal government has been mandated from that judgment, and literally so, not to release funds to states where the local government positions have not been filled in a manner of speech, with elected, officials, then it follows consequently that in the current circumstance, if the people at the local government are not people duly elected by the people, then the federal government will be entitled to withhold allocation. But this is generally speaking. Now, specifically speaking about Osun State, I'm aware, to the best of my knowledge, that those chairmen who have now since been reinstated by the order of the Court of Appeal and who have since assumed their office, if truly they have fully assumed their office, then I think it will not be necessary for federal government to withhold their local government allocation. However, it will be important for the federal government, and this is also a question of law, as decided by the Supreme Court, to ensure that the allocation are released only to the rightful recipients, that is, those who have been duly elected according to law, those reinstated by the Court of Appeal. So for me, the call of Mr. Felix Morka, would depend on the circumstances in Osun State. If that circumstance is that those in charge of the local government as I speak now are the people duly elected, from October 2022, then the federal government should not exit to release the fund directly to them. But if the state is still purporting to be in control of whatever, they did an election or what they call an election, and if they purport to still want to have the fund released to those illegally elected, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, the product of that sham of an election is illegal, and there is no constitutional basis for federal government to release, public fund to illegally elected local government chairmen. So it will depend, as I said, on circumstances. And I think in this circumstance, as I understand it, the federal government should just simply ensure that the funds are released to the rightful recipient, as I said earlier.
Okay, you did say that you were at a loss to understand